Due Process, awarded the 2005 New York Emmy for Societal Concerns Programming.
Nothing here in Trenton State Prison is easy for me. Knowing that you're innocent, but yet looked upon as though you're guilty, it's hard.
He's been in prison for rape and murder for nearly 2 decades, always insisting they had the wrong man. Now there's DNA evidence that his lawyers say proves his innocence, but Larry Peterson remains behind bars. Why won't the state agree to let him out? Has an innocent man lost 18 years? That's next on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, a private foundation focusing on New Jersey public policy issues. Additional funding provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual and online legal reference, elaw.com.
It's a question we've asked before, but one worth asking again. Could there be large numbers of innocent inmates locked up in our prisons and jails? It's a scene from your worst nightmare, but is it all too real? I'm Raymond Brown, and on this edition of Due Process, does the criminal justice system make the most serious mistakes? And does it happen on an all too regular basis? We'll get some very different responses from an attorney who works to free innocent people in prison, from a former prosecutor who says the system overwhelmingly works well, and from a man whose story we've covered here on Due Process for the last 10 years, since DNA evidence freed him after more than 12 years in state prison. But first, here's Sandy King with the story of yet another longtime inmate with a story to tell.
Raymond, it's a story that's become all too familiar since DNA testing gave new meaning to proof. After years of insisting he was innocent, Larry Peterson says he now has hard forensic evidence. And if he's successful, he could join the scores of men convicted of murder and rape, only to be exonerated long years later by DNA testing. Testing they often had to fight for, sometimes for a decade or more. Like many of them, Peterson spent most of his adult life behind bars, and he can tell you exactly how long that's been.
17 years, 7 months, 11 days. At 1 o'clock, it was 7 hours, so it's just about 2 o'clock, so it's 8 hours. And that's been much too long for something I didn't do.
Much too long to be locked up, if Larry Peterson is indeed the wrong man.
He knows that he's been proven innocent by the testing, and he knows that freedom is close.
Close, perhaps, but elusive still. It took him 10 years to win the right to DNA tests. Tests his lawyers at Barry Scheck's Innocence Project claim prove beyond question he was wrongly convicted.
None of the biological evidence from the crime scene comes from Larry Peterson, and instead there's DNA from an unknown male in the victim's mouth, in her body, underneath her fingernails.
Peterson says it just lends hard proof to what he's been saying all along, that he had no part in the rape and murder of Jacqueline Harrison, that he was an innocent man when a Burlington County jury found him guilty, and now, nearly 18 years later, still here in Trenton State Prison.
Life has just been taken away from me, knowing that you're innocent, but yet looked upon as though you're guilty. It's hard.
But through the years, Larry Peterson says he always had hope that the facts would set him free. His trial in 1989, before DNA tests changed the standard of proof, included prosecution testimony that hairs found on the body were, in fact, his.
The problem is, in 1989, you could not say that hairs match somebody.
DNA tests now show that just wasn't true, and the tests may eventually free him, but it's taken 11 years to get this far.
I told the judge then I'll be back because I knew I hadn't did anything. And I knew I would have spent every day fighting for my freedom.
A fight that first focused on DNA as an answer back in 1994, when he first applied for testing, an application that was repeatedly turned down. But through it all, Peterson wrote letters.
I get names of criminal attorneys and I write them, let them know I'm Larry Peterson, I'm innocent, I've been here for such and such amount of time, please help me.
And he finally got a response from the Cardozo Law School program with the nation's strongest record for using DNA to prove inmate innocence.
Like I know I wasn't there, didn't do anything.
The Innocence Project began litigating for access to the evidence in Larry's case in 2001.
That litigation was eventually successful, but evidence wasn't released for testing till the start of last year. And it took 12 months to get the first results, 2 more months to get a final report. But in the end, all the DNA evidence points to someone other than Larry Peterson. And yet,
I'm still fighting for my freedom.
because the Burlington County prosecutor says he's still not convinced. He wants still more testing of more forensic evidence from the murder of Jacqueline Harrison.
We'll test every single piece of evidence. Just get it done quickly, because the test results show that Larry's innocent, and if there's additional testing to be done, let's do it.
Is it so hard for a prosecutor to come and say, well, I got to agree with him, this man is innocent? Go and look for the donor that deposited the semen there. The blood samples, the hairs, go find the person that did this. But in the meantime, bring me into court and give me what belongs to me.
Your freedom.
My freedom. Justice. That's not just us. Justice.
We asked Burlington County Prosecutor Robert Bernardi to be here today. He declined, but he did issue a statement conceding that the DNA findings may help to overturn the Peterson conviction, but stating that he vehemently disagrees with the characterization of the test results as absolute or even sufficient proof of innocence. For one thing, there was testimony at trial from 4 different people who said Peterson told them that he did kill Jacqueline Harrison. Peterson's lawyers say that testimony never was credible, and now in the face of the DNA tests is irrelevant. But Bernardi insists that if Peterson is freed, he intends to try him again.
And when we come back, a former prosecutor, the executive director of the Innocence Project, and a man who won his freedom thanks to DNA tests.
Do I think innocent people are in prison? Absolutely, without a doubt.
There's a justice system that works really hard to make sure that that innocent people aren't in prison.
I think there's some people that are in the system that are wrongfully put in there.
I wouldn't say it would be high, maybe 10%, less than 10.
Our justice system is not that perfect, but it is still a strong and established legal system.
I think the system is really messed up, and a lot of innocent people could be still in there.
The system, it's not as good as it should be.
People sometimes just, they arrest them, sometimes without even knowing for sure if they'll, responsible for whatever they got arrested for,
Now they have these advanced DNA testing methods and whatnot, and some people have been released because of that. So, the system is not perfect, I guess.
Given the the publicity over the last decade of men who proved they were not guilty through DNA testing, almost everyone is now willing to concede that there may be innocent people in prison. But whether it's a widespread problem exposing deep and critical flaws in our system of investigating and prosecuting crime, well, that's where we're likely to part company. We're sure to get one point of view from Josh Donahue, a former assistant Bergen County prosecutor, quite another from Mattie DeLone, the executive director of the Innocence Project, and still another first-hand account from freed prisoner David Shepard with us from Newark. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Mattie, I want to start with you, although we're not going to talk exclusively about Mr. Peterson's case, but rather about some of the broader issues raised by DNA work. It is strange that the evidence against him of a scientific nature that was used has been demonstrated to now not involve his DNA and therefore would seem to exculpate him. That happened in February. Why are we still waiting months later? What's going to happen that's going to lead to a conclusion and a decision about his case?
Well, we wonder why we've waited so long, too, and I know that Mr. Peterson wonders. The prosecutor has decided that there's now additional evidence that was not presented against him in the original case, evidence which, in fact, they believed had nothing to do with the perpetrator of the crime, which they now want to test. And, you know, our position is they should go ahead and test it, but they should test it quickly. There's already been some delay, and there should be no more.
But what they're now waiting for is testing evidence that wasn't used against Mr. Peterson to try to convict him in his trial.
That's right. The primary evidence that we believe they're going to test now is hair evidence that was, at the time of the trial, linked to the victim herself. And there's now a question, I guess, in their mind whether that call by them was right and whether this evidence is, in fact, related to the perpetrator.
But based on what you've seen, do you think an innocent man is in prison now?
We're sure an innocent man is in prison.
Josh, obviously things happen in the criminal justice system that involve mistakes, misidentifications, wrongful convictions, and some of the work in death cases has shown surprising error rates, although errors include legal errors as well as the question of did the right guy get convicted. What's your view about whether there is some systemic problem that leads to people being wrongfully convicted?
I don't think that there's a systemic problem. I think that by definition it's a human system, so there has to be some error rate in it. But I do believe that the error rate is minimal. In order to convict an innocent person, there has to be a failing on a number of pieces of the puzzle that go into a conviction. There has to be a failing on the part of the prosecutor, there has to be a failing on the part of the defense attorney, there has to be a failing on the part of the law enforcement that initially brought the charges. There has to be a failing on the part of the judge and the jury. And it's just, in my experience, I haven't seen it. I'm not going to be so arrogant as to say it doesn't happen, but I've never seen it.
When we find a person who is innocent but had been convicted, but we're able to find that out through DNA evidence, that suggests there may be still other people where there was no DNA evidence involved but who have been wrongfully convicted. 10 years ago, when we first began due process, Barry Scheck, who's founded the Innocence Project, estimated that he thought, based on the work they'd done to that point, that maybe 10% of the prison population in the United States consisted of people who were wrongfully convicted. You think that's an unreasonable number?
I think it's yes. I think it's way, way high. Right. As I said, I've been in the system as a prosecutor and a defense lawyer for 15 years, and I've never seen it. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I'd also like to hear his definition of innocence. Does innocence mean this person did nothing? He wasn't there, he had nothing to do with the crime, or does it mean he's innocent of the particular charge he was found guilty of, but he might have been guilty of something else within the incident he was charged with?
Okay, but of course that's not the standard we would articulate. I think you would agree. Mattie, you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess we've seen the DNA cases we know about, cases where DNA has proven innocence, we would say that's proof of innocence. There have been 159 of them that we know about so far. We know several things. We know that DNA is not available in most cases. In a very small percentage of cases, if people are convicted, is DNA even a possibility for testing. We know that in their own clients, and people come to us for help, that the DNA evidence has been destroyed in many, many cases, that it is so old, that it's so degraded that we can't get results from it. So we know that these 150 cases represent only a small portion of those crimes for which people have been convicted, and perhaps even crimes for which DNA DNA testing, had it been available at the time of conviction, could have proven someone innocent. We also see time and time again through these 159 the same sorts of errors in eyewitness identifications.
Let me ask you to hold that, because I want to come back to how they come in, because
Right.
I want to get the perspective of somebody who has a unique point of view, David Shepard, who himself was in prison for more than a decade and who lived amongst men, some of whom he may believe to have been innocent. David, what's your take on whether there are significant numbers of innocent men in prison?
I think, first of all, I think 10% is about right. I really believe that. My question to the prosecutor was, what does he mean by DNA is absolute? There's no question. That's a scientific fact. There's no human error in that. If DNA says that this man is innocent, then this man is innocent. What else do we need?
Well, that question raises another question I wanted to throw out to you, Maddie, and to you, Josh, and that is, do you find generally that prosecutors are eager to embrace DNA evidence that seems to exonerate someone they've convicted, or are ego or other concerns involved making it difficult to get to the truth, even though one would think a prosecutor would want to say, well, now we can exonerate a man who didn't do it and start the search again for someone who did?
We certainly find prosecutors are happy when we come to them with claims of innocence and the possibility of DNA testing, who are willing to do the testing. And we think that's admirable and the right thing, and that's an effort to get at the truth. More often than not, though, there is a lot of resistance to testing the DNA, and then in the most extreme cases, just extraordinary effort to explain away the fact that the DNA evidence proves that the perpetrator or the person convicted of the crime did in fact not commit it. And that's very discouraging and makes the work very, very hard.
David, just so we can clarify for those who are meeting you for the first time, how long did it take you to get a DNA test and to have that result in an exoneration?
Well, it took altogether 11 and a half years. I mean, it shouldn't have took that long. Once the DNA test came back, and every test that they gave me came back that it wasn't me, that should have been the end of it. But like you said, I think a lot of times egos get in the way, and prosecutors just don't want to admit when they're wrong. And in this case, the one you were viewing earlier, I think is a question of someone's not willing to admit that they're wrong. How many tests do we have to take to decide that this guy is innocent?
Josh, in your years in the prosecutor's office, were you ever troubled by either a case that you tried or a case you were exposed to in thinking that somehow a person who was not guilty had been convicted?
Never. But what I can tell you, though, is that I believe that juries err on the side of caution, and I have seen situations where juries found people not guilty who, in my heart of hearts, I believed were guilty.
How many years were you a prosecutor?
I was a prosecutor for 7 years.
In a county that has a pretty sizable number of cases come through it. And not once did you see a case where you were at least troubled that maybe they'd gotten the wrong person, or maybe some other factor involved in the trial, bias or something else bad about a person, had led to a conviction that maybe was of a person not guilty?
No, but I have seen situations where a jury perhaps found a defendant guilty of one count that he shouldn't have been, but in such a case, I felt he was guilty of another count. But I don't think, I've never seen a situation or felt that an innocent man was prosecuted and sent to prison.
David, there was something you were saying. Go ahead.
I was saying, the question that you asked the prosecutor, I didn't think he was going to be forthcoming, because I can't believe that he's been in the county that long and there's not been one case that might have been suspect. I'm not saying that the
What about you? What in your experience leads you to believe that in a county, say like Bergen, or any other county with a large number of cases, there have to be significant number of cases where innocent people are convicted?
First of all, because prosecutors are overburdened, defense lawyers are overburdened, judges are overburdened. Most people are trying to get out of there as fast as they can. And if they got just identification, they go along with that. And it goes so quickly and so fast, everybody's not even looking at all the evidence. Sometimes they look at less than all the evidence just to get out of just to get that case over with.
Now, David mentioned identifications, and that was one of the things you were referring to, Maddie. Our own state Supreme Court has, for example, suggested great caution should be used in cross-racial identifications. How often do you think it's possible, based on the DNA work you've done, that there are cases where identifications have mistakenly led to conviction?
In the 159 DNA exonerations, approximately 3/4 of them involve cases where there was misidentification, often by the victim, sometimes by other people, and in at least one case, as many as 5 misidentifications. It's a very common practice. New Jersey, actually, to its credit, implemented a series of reforms in eyewitness practices in 2001, I believe, which we believe should be implemented across the country and would reduce the number of misidentifications. But it's the leading cause of DNA wrongful convictions, or wrongful convictions that are overturned by DNA.
Josh, let me ask you to explain, if you can, what seems to be a wide gap between the position you take and perhaps is taken by others in law enforcement, that the number of innocent convictions are small or minuscule in number, as opposed to people like David or Barry Scheck, who's worked at this for a long time, who say, look, it can be up to 10% given what we're seeing in DNA-related cases. Why do you think there's such a big gap in perception about the scope of this problem?
I can answer that.
I think that there are many times a convicted felon cannot get his head around the fact that he's done something wrong. He just can't admit it to himself. I think it's important in this whole DNA discussion to appreciate the fact, from a prosecutor's perspective, cases, in my experience, are rarely prosecuted just on one aspect, just on DNA.
David Shepard was an innocent guy, and some of the people who are saying this are scholars with some dispassion. So the question would be why there are such varying perceptions of the scope of this problem.
I can answer that.
I don't.
Let me get David in and then come back. David, go ahead.
You know why? Because police and prosecutors do not like to admit that they made a mistake. They make a mistake is come on, most prosecutors are it's about politics. You can't win an election if you putting innocent people in jail. You can't win an election if you got 10% of the people in jail and you come out and say, oh, they're innocent. That's not going to work. So that's why.
Okay, we should point out New Jersey prosecutors are political appointees, not elected officials. But David suggests a deeper point, which is that prosecutors and police, like other human beings, are prone not to admit errors or to have egos. On the other hand, of course, we have these great momentous issues dealt with in the criminal justice system. Do you think egos or an unwillingness to deal with errors is a factor on the prosecution side?
Yes, I think clearly egos enter into it. But I think the point is that DNA alone is typically not the sole source of evidence for a prosecutor. For instance, in the Peterson case, my reading of it, there were 4 people that said that Peterson confessed, plus they had DNA. So we have if DNA is in question, I can see a prosecutor saying, wait, we've got 4 people that Peterson confessed to. I'm not just going to roll over. I need to look really carefully at this. If it was just DNA, then we got to do
And that
our
is what
story.
the prosecutor's saying, but doesn't that present 2 possibilities? One is that you've had 4 people who testified either erroneously or untruthfully, and DNA is thankfully giving us a chance to look at that, or the conclusion you suggest, which is, well, the DNA was wrongfully used before. And hair evidence, which was testified to as belonging to Peterson in the first trial, which clearly wasn't his, according to DNA tests.
One of the issues in the Peterson case really is that the initial biological evidence was hair evidence, which was said to match the Mr. Peterson, which in fact it did not. It matched the victim. The second piece of biological evidence was that there was semen on her clothing.
Okay. Let me do something, which is quickly, do you think now that we've opened up to more DNA testing possibilities, we've only got 10 seconds, that there's another change that needs to take place so DNA can be used more effectively in the system?
Yeah, sorry.
People have greater access now than they did 10 years ago to DNA testing when they're convicted. Are there any other changes we need to make, or is this process going to now lead to more exonerations of innocent people?
I think that having DNA available now will be very helpful to the process. I think that preserving evidence in old cases so we have a chance to go back and look at them is very important. Many of our clients are just lucky that the DNA was there because most places, including New Jersey, don't have preservation statutes that make you preserve the old evidence, and those need to be held on to.
Josh, I gather you're not losing sleep over the fact that there may be large numbers of innocent people in prison. This doesn't seem to you to be an overwhelming problem.
It doesn't, in my opinion, and I truly believe this as corny as it sounds. Prosecutors are there to do justice, and I haven't seen any that have abused that.
David, are you optimistic or pessimistic about change in the future?
I'm pessimistic. And if he's speaking for prosecutors, you can see why.
Well, there is so much more we could say on this subject, but unfortunately we're out of time. My thanks to Josh Donahue, Maddie DeLone, and David Shepard, and my invitation to you at home to join us here next week for another cutting-edge issue of Law and Justice. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
I wrote everyone. I used to order 20 stamps, and I would take 20 stamps and send 20 different letters to different attorneys all over. I go to the law library, I get names of criminal attorneys, and I write a letter to them. I'm Larry Peterson, I'm innocent, I've been here for such and such amount of time. Please help me. And one day the Innocent Project wrote back and said, well, send us this, and that. Before I could finish reading the letter, I was getting copies, sending it out.
Were you shocked when you got that letter?
Shocked, surprised, with a smile on my face this large.
Did you know who these people were?
No.
No.
No, but I had read of them.
Major funding for due process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, a private foundation focusing on New Jersey public policy issues. Additional funding provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual and online legal reference, elaw.com.